This is day 2. Bevie checking in with everybody, hoping all our friends and family and any other listeners we don't know are staying safe. Keep the laughter in the house, be silly, spend time together, and do some things maybe that you haven't planned to do but you haven't had time for because a lot of us have got the time for it now. This is something I've been wanting to do a long time. So if you're joining us from yesterday, hello again. This is chapter 2. John Watson was the second child of Albert and Doris Watson. His was a simple existence. Being the oldest son, it would be he that would take over the family business because his elder sibling was his sister, and women obviously cannot run businesses. Their roles were cooking, cleaning, and steering the canal boats. The family business was transporting coal, and the small back helmsman's cabin of Albert's 60-foot-long barge had been birthplace, playground, school, and home for all of his 17 years. Boyhood had ended when he was 6, and working began at sunrise every morning. As a young boy, his working day would begin with feeding and harnessing their proud horse Toby to the canal barge. It would end some 14 hours later. It was a hard life of toil with little time off, but it was better than most, and in his world, he was happy with his lot in life. At 17 years old, he was now a man with a man's responsibilities. He shared the hard toil of shoveling coal and clogging the barge through tunnels. That was a part of the work he enjoyed, as he would take the clogging plank from the side of the barge and lay it across the bow bulkhead, with his father Albert sitting on the starboard side of the plank, his legs raised and feet on the inside wall of the tunnel, and John on the port side in the same position. With their backs together, they would walk the entire length of tunnel. The time spent together in the tunnel was used to discuss matters of business, and much to Albert's disdain, the new power supply sweeping the land. Whilst this was happening, John's sister and younger brother would take Toby over the hill that the barge was passing through. Doris Watson would be below deck, preparing a stew-type meal for the men to eat when they reached the other side and were waiting for Toby and his handlers to arrive. Once the horse was back on the canal side, fed, watered, and reharnessed to the barge, the rest of the family would eat, while the men carried on the journey. Moving coal along the canal was slow, hard work for all involved. The wages were poor, and the hours were long, but for this particular family, Mother Nature had provided something in abundance, and that something was love. Just before daybreak, the first to rise would be Doris Watson. She slept on the very outside of the makeshift bunk because she was always the last to get in and the first to get out. She would get the stove going after collecting some kindling. It was winter, and outside the ice was biting through the holes in her boots, which let in the cold and damp. But at least she had boots, and her feet would soon be warm. It wasn't long before the kettle was boiling and toast was ready, so she woke her daughter Alice from her slumber to help her. When the breakfast table was laid out, Alice woke her father Albert and her brothers John and James so they could eat their breakfasts. As soon as the Watson men had eaten their breakfasts of tea and toast, they started work. Albert and John began breaking the ice that was freezing their boat to its port side mooring. and with long poles began cracking the ice on its starboard side. Meanwhile, young James tended and prepared Toby for his long day ahead. It was sunrise, and what little warmth the winter's sun would bring was a welcome relief. This, however, was not the time to think about warmth. It was time to think about getting to the coal bunker before everyone else, and to load up with the most powerful fuel of all time, coal. John explained to Albert that he had heard men talking about steam engines that could run on rails. Albert, however, continuously convinced him that his future was safe, because nothing could ever compete with a horse as strong as Toby. John was not totally convinced about this, but he did say, "That's true, Dad," to make Albert feel better. On both sides of Albert's canal boat was a sign he was proud of: Albert Watson and Son, showing bold and black upon what used to be bright red boards, but constant wiping off have dulled the red somewhat. John was proud of his father and respected his work ethic and guidance. At the pickup point, a long line of horse-drawn coal carts were emptying their precious cargo onto the few barges that had broken free from the morning ice. Albert's boat was third in line, so there was time for a warming brew and a rest before the day started properly. Alice brought her dad and younger brothers a steaming mug of tea. "Alice, how pretty you look on this fine morning," said Albert with a beaming smile. "Why, thank you, kind sir," she replied with a curtsy. "It's my birthday today, and my ma'am has made me this new pinafore. I look like a proper lady," she said with the most excited expression. "Not for much longer, sis," laughed John, as he put his mug of strong tea down and raced after his sister with his coal-stained hands outstretched in front of him. Alice screamed and jumped off the boat, running down the towpath past Toby, much to the amusement of the boating community, who all smiled at her as she ran past. "Come on, you two," shouted Albert with a proud smile upon his face. "There's work to be done, John boy, and chores to be done, birthday or not. Birthday presents, whatever next." "What's that, Albert?" said Bert Wheelwright from the next barge. "These young'uns with their birthdays," replied Albert. "I never had time for birthdays. Come to think of it, I don't even know when mine is or how old I am for that matter," he said with a hearty laugh, his hands on both hips. Both men chuckled as a cloud of dust from the coal being loaded onto Bert's barge rolled over the canal, and Bert disappeared within it. Back inside the barge, Alice told her mother to take a breather whilst she cleaned up the dishes. When that was done, Alice placed the bunk back into the bulkhead, making the 5'7" cabin into a small living room. When her mom had drunk her tea, she got on with starting on the men's dinners. Albert, John, and young James would eat their dinners on deck, whilst Doris and Alice had theirs on the portable table in the cabin. Eating, however, was a long way off, and there was much to do above and below deck. The coal had been filled into the hold, and Leeds was half a day's pull for Toby on the Air and Calder navigation. All the Watson children loved to go to the great metropolis. What it must be like to wander along its cobbled streets and look at the fine gentlemen, said Alice to her mother. "Fine gentlemen, is it?" said Doris. "And what would you say, Alice, if you saw your fine gentleman? I don't know, said Alice, and both women laughed together. In fact, laughter was the norm on board the canal barge named Lightning. John Watson was daydreaming at the helm when his dad said, "Penny for 'em?" John laughed. "You haven't got a penny." Then they both burst into laughter. "We live in a changing world, Dad." "How so?" replied Albert. "There are magic lanterns in Leeds that don't need candles. They are powered by something called gas." "What nonsense!" scoffed Albert. "It's true, Dad. Alan Wheelwright told me. He's actually seen them." "You mean Bert's lad?" queried Albert. "Well, he's a good lad, and he doesn't lie, but it just seems a bit farcical to me." "Can I have a quick look when we get there, Dad? I will be back within the hour," said John hopefully. "After we have unloaded, but only an hour, mind. You know your mother doesn't like you out late," agreed Albert. Albert looked up at the sky and thought, "I hope he gets to see his magic lamps, and it would be lovely if Alice could meet a nice young man." "Oh, enough of this nonsense," he quipped, as his eyes focused back on the sky. He noticed what looked like a storm brewing, with a very strange cloud formation over the center of Leeds, which Albert now had at his bow. As Albert gently eased the boat to its mooring alongside a dark and dusty mill on the canal bank, the winch was already making its way downward with its grabber pan open. With John on one end of the grabber and Albert on the other, they both began to push the two ends together. Before long, the first load of coal was making its way skyward as the two very burly men tugged at the other side of the pulley. After this had been repeated many times, the hold was empty. "Right then, Dad, I'll be off to Leeds then," announced John. "Have a care, John. I don't like the looks of that nasty cloud," replied Albert. "A bit of rain won't bother me, Dad," laughed John as he leapt over the gunwale and onto the canal bank. "John, stop!" cried Alice. "I'm coming with you." "Ma'am said it was okay, Dad," said Alice as she kissed Albert and ran off before he'd time to reply. "Oh, come on then, sis, and keep up. We only have an hour," replied John as they walked briskly along the towpath. The two siblings both wondered what lay ahead. John's mind was full of technological marvels. Alice, on the other hand, was deep in thought about what she might say if she met a young gentleman. And would she blush if he inquired after her name? As John and Alice reached the warehouses that lined the canal just before Leeds Bridge, Alice let out a scream. She was looking up at the sky. The strange cloud formation was now directly above them. Alice stopped and threw her arms around John, burying her head deep in his chest, muffling her anguished cry. John glanced up and saw what could only be described as a cloud swirling in ever-decreasing circles, and its mouth was heading straight for them. He tried to pull his sister to safety, but his old boots seemed rooted to the damp ground. With his arms firmly round his sister, he felt the first finger of the swirling cloud take his flat cap from his head. He was now as afraid of this unworldly phenomenon as his poor sister, who was screaming quite freely. He wanted to join in screaming with her, but he was a man now, so that was out of the question. There was now a deafening sound of wind screeching in their ears, with short bursts of lightning flashing through the tunnel that had formed around and above them. As they both stared up the tunnel-shaped whirling cloud, the realization was that it wasn't going upward at all. The top of the cloud had come to rest upon the top floor of the adjacent warehouse on the other side of the canal. John and Alice's boots were no longer rooted to the ground. In fact, they were both slowly drifting inexorably towards the warehouse. Alice screamed, What's happening?" I don't know, sis. Just hold on tight to me. I won't let you go," answered John, his voice now distinctly quivering. Tears were streaming down Alice's face and onto her new pinafore as she looked at the building growing ever closer. "Look," shouted John. "I can see two people standing just in front of the building. They seem to be floating near the top of it," he continued. "I don't like it, John. I want to go home," sobbed Alice. "Me too," announced a now very scared John Watson as he cuddled his sister ever tighter. "They're coming towards us," he continued. What do they want with us? We haven't done anything wrong," mumbled Alice into her brother's chest. I don't know, sis. Just close your eyes really tight. They might not see us." Chapter 3. Amanda Winters arrived back to a quiet house after yet another afternoon of clothes shopping at yet another exclusive outlet. The only light was emanating from the slightly open door of her husband's study. She let her shopping bags drop to the floor and marched along the long sliver of light shining through the door. As she was hoping that he would have started dressing for their daughter's party, she was outraged to find him in a deep slumber. "Alfred!" screamed Amanda. He woke with a start as he leapt out of his chair and shouted, "What's happened?" "What has happened? I have had to carry my own shopping in from the car whilst you were taking it easy, doing nothing, as usual," snapped Amanda. Just like a faulty pressure cooker giving way to built-up pressure, Alfred Winter's frustrations exploded. "That's it! I have had enough! Things are going to change round here, starting, madam, with you," he growled. Alfred Winters pushed past his dazed, open-mouthed wife and stormed out of his study into the lounge. Upon entering the room, he picked up the phone and called his daughter to deliver the bombshell that the party was off. Within seconds, Amanda's mobile was ringing with the name Alicia flashing on its screen. Amanda answered the phone and Alfred said, "Allow me to take your bags, dear." Jamie Winters and Freddie Chambers had spent most of the day outside, working on what they had decided was going to be the station ticket office. The day had been quite bright until a strange cloud formation threatened to rain on them. Looking at the clock, Freddie alerted Jamie to the time. Upon looking at said clock, Jamie shrugged his shoulders and said, "I don't suppose you will reconsider your decision, Fred?" Let me think. I can come with you and spend time with the bitch from hell and her stomach-wrenching, spoilt, brainless bimbo cow of a daughter, or stay here all night and work, mopping the floor with my tongue. It's the latter for me, matey, was Fred's long but very honest reply. I'll take that as a no, then. By the way, will you check something for me?" asked Jamie. "Sure. What do you want checking?" Freddie replied. "Down in the cellar, behind the white brick, I've left some instructions for you to follow." "I know it sounds dramatic, but in 1 hour's time, would you take that brick out of the wall and follow those instructions exactly to the letter, please?" asked Jamie, looking serious for a moment, but then smiling at his best friend. Jamie had no idea why he had told his friend to do this. His subconscious mind must have taken over his thoughts for a short time. Okay. In 1 hour, remove the white brick that has moss growing on it and very old mortar securing it in its place so I can read the letter you have left for me," he scoffed. "I know it sounds crazy, and I don't know why I'm saying it, but you must do exactly as the letter says. Your future happiness depends upon it," replied Jamie quite seriously. "Okay, in 1 hour, remove the brick, read about the future, and then see you in a week, Mystic Meg," said Freddie. "What?" asked Jamie. "You've got me at it now. See you tomorrow," replied Freddie, looking puzzled. In the bushes, just behind the building they had been working on, a beautiful elderly lady with very long white hair smiled to herself and walked away. Back at the mansion, Amanda Winters, although still in a state of shock due to her husband's outrageous behavior, tried to console her distraught, darling little girl. Amanda agreed with her that her father was, without doubt, the worst father in existence. "I will make sure he changes his mind, and don't forget, you are his little princess," said a very confident Amanda. "This is the worst birthday anybody could possibly have. He better make up for it with something nice. I hate him! I hate him! I hate him!" screamed Alicia. "I know, my darling, but I'll make that old skinflint pay. Just see if I don't," announced a now battle-ready Amanda. The battle, however, was short-lived, for as she entered the room where Alfred was, she noticed he had her credit and bank cards in one hand and the largest pair of scissors she had ever seen in the other. I'm glad you're here to witness this. I've already canceled Alicia's cards, and now it's your turn," said Alfred with aggression in his voice. Amanda looked on in horror as the top blade of the scissors caught the light and glinted into her eyes as it sliced through the only thing in the world that she truly cared for. Her eyes rolled upwards, and her legs gave way beneath her, and she fell to the ground. This was not the well-rehearsed faint that had produced so many nice things through the year. This was the real deal. As Alfred strolled over her prostrate form, he dropped the now defunct cards on her ample but paid-for bosom. For what seemed the first time in his life, Alfred Winters had finally stood up for himself, and it felt good. With all the party guests canceled, only one person was making his way to Alicia's apartment. In fact, it was the only person who didn't want to go. Remembering his phone had been switched off all afternoon, Jamie switched it back on as he arrived at Alicia's building. He noticed once again the strange cloud in the sky, only now it was swirling round the top of the building, He could see his sister out on the balcony, looking down into the canal. She was crying profusely. Jamie quickly entered the code for the door from the piece of paper his father had given him. He opened the door and ran to the elevator, entering a second code for the penthouse. Soft music filled his ears as he was elevated upwards. The door to the apartment swished open, and Jamie ran to the balcony, where he grabbed his sister and turned her around to face him. "What's wrong, Alicia?" said Jamie. "Everything is ruined. I wish I was miles away from here," she screamed. "Pull yourself together," shouted Jamie. He had to shout because the noise created by the winds was now deafening. With Alicia's head buried against his chest, he looked over his sobbing sibling into what had become a whirlwind behind her. Now the cloud formation was not in the sky at all. It was a tunnel emanating from the towpath on the other side of the canal. Alicia's screams became louder as both her and her brother's feet were wrenched from the balcony and into the vortex, which now had lightning flashing all around it. Once inside this swirling, flashing tunnel, Jamie's grip on his sister grew tighter. He realized they were not alone in this vortex. There were what looked like a man and a woman, as helpless as they were, advancing towards them. Jamie instinctively put Alicia behind him to offer some protection. As he did, the two sets of siblings converged and passed through each other like phantoms. Both Jamie Winters and John Watson caught each other's glance the instant both pairs of hugging siblings passed by one another. In a flash, they were back, one pair on the towpath and the other on the balcony. The problem was they were both on the wrong side of the canal. Without knowing, they were on the wrong side of time. Once again, a beautiful elderly lady with very long white hair had to now put into place an experiment that would determine the fate of humanity in the 21st century.